oldest NGO in his country, in the Angola. And he also he also is the Canadian honorary consul to Angola, and a member of the board of several international development institutions. Alan Cain was made an officer of the Order of Canada, Canada's highest honor for his lifetime development work and his contribution to peace building in Angola. He has lectured at the university in Canada, Angola, Norway, USA, South Africa, and UK. His articles and papers have been published widely in international journals. Alan Cain is also one of the founding members of ICCCASU, an international think tank for promoting sustainable and inclusive urban development in a forum based on the diverse but complementary experience of Canada, China, and African nations. He is currently adjunct professor of Azariah School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University, and part-time professor at the School of International Development and Global Study of the University of Ottawa. And in addition, and we just very recently got a great news that Alan Cain received honorary degree from University Gulf last week. So we are so much the pleasure that after he got this honorary degree, then give the first speaker here. So thank you very much. Let's welcome again.
Thank you very much, Professor Cao, co-president of ICCCASU. So now the floor is yours, Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Tonton, and Professor Cao, thank you so much for those very kind words. This is a great opportunity to speak with U.S. students in international development here at University of Ottawa, but also online, some of our colleagues, some of our ICCCASU colleagues. I'm going to speak about the broad issue of
Oh, do you want me to start again?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Once more, thank you, Tonton, and for the kind words, Professor Cao. It's a pleasure to be here at University of Ottawa with you, and also online with some of our ICCCASU colleagues. I'm going to speak on the theme of urban challenges in the Global South, but particularly from my point of view from Angola, where I'm working, which is has been over the last 2 decades China's principal African trading partner. So we'll be looking at the specific trends in urbanization in the Global South, and looking at really the similarities and differences between the Chinese and African urbanization models. So I'll start with Okay, sorry. In the year 2009, the number of people living in cities surpassed the number of people living globally in rural areas. And it's now expected over the last 10, 15 years and into the future that the principal growth of populations will be in the less developing regions in the global south. By 2050, it's anticipated, if the trends in current today continue, that 6.3 billion people will live in cities, but most of them will be living as the urban poor. The shifts and the current trends are largely provoked by climate change and the environmental crisis that we're experiencing today. Latin America, over the last 40 years, has moved from a position not very different from Africa and Asia to presently having over 80% of their population urban. But in Africa and Asia, still the estimated urban population is around 40%, but growing quickly. In the least developing countries in the global south, roughly 78% of the population live in slums today. So I'm afraid somebody's going to have to move ahead. Yeah. It's generally agreed that migration is the principal form of growth in the early stages of urbanization. But as regions become more urbanized, the natural growth, or the growth due to the high birth rate and the extension of lives of the elderly, becomes the dominant factor in urbanization. And this graphic here shows the trends over the last 75 years. And we can see that today Africa and Asia are roughly 50% urbanized, and but the rest of the world, Europe and Latin America, are roughly 80%. Let me see if I can move the. No, I'm afraid you're going to have to move ahead from there. The social climatic factors are the principal motors for migration and for the growth of cities. This migration is provoked by civic strife, people fleeing the countryside for either conflict or environmental reasons, seeking refuge in the relatively more secure urban areas. Many people migrate to cities with the expectation of being able to go back to their rural homes in the future, but we find, as a rule of thumb, populations that spend more than 2 years in the city are likely to remain and not return to their areas of to their traditional rural areas. And many people never return. But migration also brings certain advantages in dialogue between rural and urban areas. And many of the new migrants really are involved economically in economic activities that straddle both urban and rural areas. And sometimes encouraging or promoting informal trade between the cities and their original rural origin, areas of origin. You go ahead, please. Yeah. This is a graphic showing the average annual rate of urban change in different regions of the world. But we can see from this that Africa and Asia are urbanizing more rapidly than other regions. But areas that have already a relatively high level of urbanization are growing at a much slower rate. So in the early stages, growth is rapid and the growth declines over time. Next, please. Now, really the theme of this talk is to look at China's influence on African urbanization. Africa and China both have urban growth rates that exceed the global average. Chinese trade and financing is now really one of the most important factors in urbanization in African cities. The new models of Chinese bilateral cooperation, particularly through strategic public-private partnerships, are new ways that affect and finance urban planning and infrastructure projects, transport projects in Africa, and large-scale residential development. Next, please. These are a few photographs of examples of the kinds of Chinese, let's say, footprint on Africa that we can see visually through housing development, through rapid rail links, but also in informal trade. China's Chinese goods and even Chinese migrants are involved in informal trade in Africa. So we can see that the Chinese influence is not just in the formal sector, but also in the informal areas. Next, please. Now, these are interesting graphics that show the different modes of both Asian and not just Chinese, but broadly Asian urbanization. We can see that urbanization in Asia, and particularly in China, has largely corresponded with the reduction of poverty, where in sub-Saharan Africa, this is not the case. We can see that while there is a growth of urban populations, the impact of urbanization on poverty has hardly had an impact. I mean, there's still poverty levels remain quite high. Next, please. Some of the notable differences between African cities and Chinese cities are the presence of slums in African cities and the level of informality and lack of planning control in many African cities. And that's probably the presence of slums is the clearest signal that Africa has not learned from the Chinese model of urban management. And slums are the consequence of the lack of sufficient investment in infrastructure in African cities. Chinese urban expansion as a result of movement of labor from rural to urban areas and the transformation of economies from agriculture to industry and services. In Africa, urbanization is largely still fueled by natural resource extraction and export, rather than improvements in manufacturing and productivity, as we find in China. Next slide, please. Now, this is an interesting global map produced by UN Habitat for the Habitat 3 meetings that ICCCASU was very active in 2016. But this shows the during the era of the habitat agenda, the reduction of slums in we can see in Asia is significant, but the percentage of populations living in slums in Africa has not changed very much in those 15 years of the leading up to the Habitat 3 agenda. Next slide, please. The growth of Chinese cities needs to be studied in terms of learning how urbanization, economic modernization, and how cities in China are recognized as engines of growth. One of the key reforms in China was the devolution of central government to municipalities in the promotion of urbanization and economic development. One of the key powers that was transferred to municipalities in China was the control over land use decisions and land use management. Land-based financing became critical for the growth of Chinese cities and Chinese economic development during the years from 1980 through to the current to today. Revenue was generated by in Chinese cities by land leasing and rezoning and conversion of rural to urban land. And the attraction or the of investment in urban infrastructure was largely financed through the process of land value capture. Next slide, please. Now, this is a graphic. It's interesting, showing the concept of a Gini coefficient is you probably all know is a measurement for qualifying inequality between poverty and wealth in communities, and the closer to zero, the closer to a more equitable city, and the closer to 1 on the scale is more inequitable cities. And we can see that the 5 most inequitable cities in the world are in Africa. Johannesburg, Luanda, where I live, is number 2, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Maseru, and we can see that by and large, inequality and high Gini coefficient is one of the characteristics of African cities. Next, please. This slide drills down further and really looks at some of the characteristics of this inequality that we find in African cities. And we can see, well, this is a comparison of the control or the voice that women have in decisions, in urban decisions. And we can see that in Africa, the inequality of the power of women in terms of urban decision-making is one of the most critical problems in inequality. Next, please. Now a look at Chinese urbanization. You can go on to the next slide. As I mentioned, the growth of Chinese cities has been rapid during this period, and that one of the key characteristics of urbanization is the fact that government policy recognizes cities as being engines of growth. So urbanization is seen as a positive feature of economic growth and poverty reduction. Since 1980, China's urbanization increased from 19% to over 50% today. Growth, as I said, has been driven by migration. Next, please. But the urbanization has had important, not always positive, impact on rural areas as well. Areas have been urbanized, and many rural lands have been incorporated and converted into urban areas. Next, please. Now here we have to talk about the Shenzhen model. As you know, Shenzhen is China's, I think it still is, fastest growing city, with a population growth rate of over 20% a year. But what's significant is that the GDP, or the economic growth of Shenzhen, is even more rapid than its population growth. And urbanization has resulted in industrialization, modernization, improved living standards, improved social security, public health for the populations living at least in Shenzhen. China has claimed to have eliminated poverty, or at least severe poverty, in the year 2020. And the Gini coefficient that mentioned in the previous slide has actually declined in Shenzhen, so that that means that it's declined from almost 5.5 down to 0.3 in 2013. And this is the latest data that I have, and I don't have current data on this, but we can see that the city's success, at least during that period of time, was, in terms of equitable growth, was significant. Yeah, some of this data that we have is from the presentations made at the Habitat 3 meeting in Ecuador, that where and it's been more difficult to get data in the last 2 or 3 years, unfortunately. But as I mentioned earlier, next, please, yeah. A key was in the success was the Chinese government's devolution of powers from central levels of government down to municipalities. And I also mentioned that the key powers, one of the key powers handed down to municipalities was decisions over land management and the opportunities to introduce land-based financing. Next, please. But there are problems with land-based finance that are becoming evident as the model becomes more mature. In the year 2000, over half of municipal revenue was for municipalities was generated by land sales or fees from real estate developers. And developers made most of their money from constructing luxury housing, high-end housing, despite the central government's development targets for encouraging developers or real estate developers to invest in affordable housing. But it was these policy orientations of central government were not really respected. financing went into the high end of the market. One of the reforms that was introduced in municipal control of land was that land rights could be traded on the markets in China. But in this process, as I mentioned, rural land was absorbed. Village land quite often was converted from collectively communally owned rural land into urban land, and this process of land conversion had very little grassroots or citizen participation in decision making, and these were often deals between municipal administrators and real estate developers. Next, please. China's new urban challenges are around the hyper speculation that resulted in this model of high-end residential commercial development boom that happened in the last 10 or 15 years. The orientation towards luxury housing, and land has emerged more recently as a major source of profit and revenue, but also a growing source of inequality in cities. Urban environmental problems have emerged as all over the world, but in Chinese cities of severe pollution, contamination of water, and water shortages. Civic protests were on the rise. The poor who were denied their claims to rights to the city, as well as the encroachment on rural communities and the expropriation of their land for urbanization properties on the margins of cities. Next, please. Environmental problems due to air quality, pollution. Next, please. And in increasing civic unrest, resistance to forced removals. Next, please. So we can see that in the years, particularly in the last decade, the emergence of a real estate bubble in many Chinese cities that have resulted in, next please, really a demonstration of the limits of land value capture in the Chinese context. In recent years, the room for incremental generation of revenue has diminished. The opportunities of leasing land as the land gets absorbed into a high-end real estate speculation, the opportunities of leasing diminish. And at least in the coastal regions of China, it may be that cities have already exhausted the opportunities in land lease revenue, or at least they're on the decline. And cities have to look for new forms of revenue streams, new forms of probably land taxation that rather than the sale of leases, there needs to be more sustainable, longer term opportunities in financing for Chinese cities. Next, please. Now, try again. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, next, just hit that again, please. I'm sorry about this. Yeah, sorry. I don't know how those slides got shifted around in there, but looking at the African urban challenges, over 2/3, and I'm going to be focusing on Luanda, where I have been based for the last 40 years or more, where over 2/3 of Luanda's population lives in informal slums called museks. Next, please. Just briefly looking at post-war Angola. Angola suffered 4 decades of conflict, including 27 years of civil war, and huge percentage of rural populations fled the countryside to the relative safety of the large cities, and particularly to settle in the shanty towns or slums around the capital cities like Luanda, but it's some of the other coastal cities. When the war ended in 2002, Angola had been promised by particularly Western donors in the World Bank a massive investment, reconstruction aid, and post-conflict reconstruction aid that didn't appear, that was denied. I mean, any of those of you who can remember back in 2002, it was the emergence of the Western donors were preoccupied with the new war in Iraq and engagement in Afghanistan. The attention shift away from African conflict was, I mean, donors were really preoccupied with Central Asia and new conflicts there. For a war-devastated country such as Angola, access to Chinese financing offered a really unique opportunity to rebuild the national infrastructure that had been devastated during the war years. Next, please. Angola has emerged as, over the last 20 years, as really, I think, China's principal African trading partner, with an estimated investment in 2021 of about $21 billion. And Chinese financing has been used to rebuild the country's damaged infrastructure. It was really critical in the, particularly in the central highlands of Angola, where the war was the hottest, really. Of all of that Chinese financing, roughly 16.5 billion was used for investment in urban infrastructure, including water sanitation, housing, but it's resulted in Angola's debt to China in 2020 of over $22 billion. Next, please. Probably the most well-known and largest investment Chinese financing in Angola was the new city of Quilamba that I've written about and many colleagues have studied over the years. Next slide. So the government of Angola has been able to use financing from Chinese credit facilities to build prestige projects like the housing project in Quilamba, which provided initially 20,000 flats. Another further 5,000 flats have been built in recent years. But these apartments were initially too expensive for most of the Angolan population. They were, while the plan was to build social housing, they were really, these flats were really more appropriate for the higher end of the market. And in order to encourage the sale of these flats, the government introduced a highly subsidized form of rent purchase, even to make those apartments affordable for upper and middle level civil servants. So in no way was this really social housing as it was initially built. The Chinese intervention in African urban development really helped to mop up some of that surplus African oil and commodity wealth that that had accumulated in, and to some extent met some of the surplus housing demand, but at the higher end of the market. Next, please. The process of building Kilamba land was expropriated at little cost by the government, who was the technically the owner and manager of all land in the country. Next, please. But financing for Kilamba and many other Chinese projects in Angola, housing and urban infrastructure projects were partly facilitated by the Angolan state's role of concession as a concessioner of land, but largely through long-term oil-backed loans from China. Land was acquired at almost no cost, and it's interesting. Both China and Angola as a post-socialist country both lack private freehold property rights, and the state has powers to compulsory expropriate land in both countries, and certainly it was used extensively in the post-conflict period in Angola. But unlike China, in Angola, the urban projects were managed by a national level office, where in China, municipalities were engaged in the process of promoting urbanization. But like China, Angola has produced an oversupply of high-end housing, and resulting in a recent fall in a decline of real estate values. So this has actually provoked a commercial housing crisis, because there's very little incentive for private sector to invest in land when the state has subsidized the high end of the market. The natural natural clientele of commercial developers would have been that market that the state is subsidizing in Angola. But little state financing has been left over for the kinds of urban development that my organization, Development Workshop, has promoted in site and service slum upgrading projects. Next slide, please. And this is a graphic that demonstrates who benefited from state financing of housing. We can see that the left-hand column is a annual household income graph, and the right-hand column is a description of the kinds of housing that were provided for or that were affordable by to those segments of the population. We can see that the state subsidized rent-to-purchase apartments really benefited from only the middle class and actually the upper end of that middle class. And when we can see the numbers of people who benefit, it's relatively small compared to the demand for housing by those who can only afford informal sector housing, or what we call backyard rentals, where people will rent out build a shack in the backyard of formal housing and rent that out. So we can see that looking at the whole housing economy, the Chinese investment or the Chinese financing, I'm reluctant to use the term investment because this isn't really Chinese investment. This is not FDI from China. This is money borrowed credit lines from China. So this is basically national financing that is backed by Chinese credit lines. And of course, this financing has to be repaid and has resulted in a massive debt now to China. Next slide, please. Now, just a look at really how the poor really access housing. Land and housing is accessed by the poor through informal markets in Angola, as in most African countries as well. Luanda has a thriving informal land market. We carried out a very extensive informal land market study with support from the World Bank a number of years ago. And in the process of that study, we identified that 85% of those who've acquired their land or housing through informal mechanisms consider that they are legitimate owners of that land or housing. But in fact, most of these transactions are not recognized legally, and only less than 7% of that housing actually has secure land tenure. So this puts land and housing occupiers in urban areas at a risk of losing their assets through the process of forced removals and demolitions of their slum areas or informal areas and relocation to other areas. Next, please. This is a graphic showing some of the means of transactions in the informal market, from signs posted on call boxes or telephone poles, down to online real estate sites that are really also extensions of the informal market. So transactions are carried out in many different forms. Next slide, please. But really, this has resulted in increasing tenure insecurity for the poor. The poor occupy today in Angolan cities some of the most valuable inner city real estate. And as land values increase, pressures from private developers actually make inner city high value slum areas high risk for insecure tenure. The forced removals of inner city slums have resulted in a kind of township style resettlement out on the distant periphery of cities, following, I must say, very much from a Southern African point of view, an apartheid model of urbanization, of moving the poor, not based on race, but moving the poor to the far periphery limits of beyond the urbanized part of the city. And really, the expropriation of the poor's assets that are held in their land and housing really deepens poverty in the long run. Next, please. My organization, Development Workshop, has worked in collaboration with UN Habitat and the Ministry of Urbanization in Angola setting up Angola's first urban observatory that tracks some of these processes. And more recently, together with UN Habitat, we have been engaged by the government to develop a new housing policy reform that would address some of these findings that I've been talking about, problems, and to develop a new slum upgrading strategy. So I'm optimistic in terms of a new reform agenda that the Angolan government is adopting. Unfortunately, the boom years of high oil prices and easy credit lines have been wasted on the kinds of development that I've been describing earlier. And we're dealing with now, looking forward, a high debt situation where much of that housing that was built, the Quilambas and others, were built on loans from China that will still be being paid off for the next at least the next decade, possibly the next generation. But the approach that we're taking through the Urban Observatory is engaging stakeholders from government and communities to produce data together with the universities, some of the universities in Angola, but always by engaging with local government in the process of co-ownership of data. The advantage of collecting data through civil society, academic, and government partners is that the ownership of that data is already in the hands of government. So when doing advocacy, we are not accused of producing spurious information as to criticize government, because this is data that was collected together with government. And in the collection of in these processes of monitoring urbanization, local communities have developed partnerships and have come to know, now can knock on the doors of the local administrators, and created spaces of consultation and negotiation between communities, government, and civil society. In this next slide, please. In the process of collecting data through co-participation of different actors, we are using participatory monitoring, using participatory mapping, using GIS, using tablets, and getting information into the public domain as quickly as we can. So I'm going to end. Next slide, please. Just with a couple of slides relating to the conclusions of this presentation. We can see that Chinese cities became sites of innovation where entrepreneurs, bureaucrats, and migrant workers combined to create substantial economic growth and reduce poverty in Chinese cities. But the supply of service land has been decreasing in recent years. But decentralization of decision-making to municipalities has been a key to the success of that model. But urban African growth has been largely funded, in Angola as a classic case, funded by extractive industries, cheap international credit lines that were available over the last 20 years. But failing commodity prices, while they've temporarily increased in the last because of the conflicts in Ukraine, but generally there has been a decline in commodity prices over the last 5 or 10 years, has derailed this model from the African point of view. Chinese lessons of municipal development and land value capture may be adapted in Africa, but they have to take into consideration the problems encountered in China, the social problems, the conflict problems, environmental problems that rapid urbanization produced in China, and the need for economic sustainability. But we can see from the African model that the consultation and participatory planning are key to the key strategies for inclusive economic urban poverty reduction in Africa. So there are lessons to learn from both Chinese and African experiences. A key question for the next slide, sorry, for key challenges are really asking the question why African cities have not succeeded in generating increased incomes for urban development. And it's very useful looking at some of the lessons from China. There are 4 key experiences that we feel China can offer some advice or guidance for. One of them is a clarifying system of land ownership and proactive planning. This is obviously, even in China, with the state being a major actor in control of land ownership has and the management of land is well controlled in China, and planning is proactive rather than reactive. The next proactive investment in infrastructure before land is developed rather than after. In African experience, more often when infrastructure finally reaches cities in urbanizing, it's quite often after the fact of housing, after it's not a proactive process of infrastructure provision. And probably one of the really key lessons is empowering local governments to raise financing through and using land value capture and other means of locally generating income for improvements in basic infrastructure and improved livability. And finally, ensuring better physical connectivity through, and we didn't talk a lot about this in this presentation, but ICCCASU is very much engaged in some of these questions about urban transport and smart connectivity in urban areas. So these are some of the lessons that we can learn from China in Africa. Now, one of the key opportunities, particularly in post-socialist countries like Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, is to learn from China, particularly around the conversion and registration of state monopoly land, land managed by the state, but also to learn from the dangers associated with those models. Land conversion remains an untapped opportunity in many African cities, certainly in Angola. But it needs to, the model needs to ensure that the capture of value from land conversion goes to the public benefit, not just the private sector, not just the commercial entrepreneur. The importance of local municipal government in ensuring that some of the benefits of land value capture are retained and invested in improved urban infrastructure, and the reduction of inequality in cities, the reduction of poverty. Municipalities have that opportunity of using revenues for urban upgrading, for slum area upgrading, and the provision of social housing. So I'm going to end there with a final slide, a little advertisement about ICCCASU, which we many of you are aware of, but just as Professor Chow mentioned, ICCCASU is a nonprofit think tank. We've been working together for the last 7 or 8 years, and it's a really interesting model of North-South, but also South-South cooperation. And I think particularly the opportunities in policy-oriented research that ICCCASU offers in comparisons between, and I've addressed the comparison between China and Africa in this presentation. But there are many lessons to learn through ICCCASU in similar kinds of policy-oriented research. So I'm going to end there, and thanks very much for this opportunity. Move to the last slide. You can move to the last slide.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
This was a wonderful presentation. So I don't know if you have something like mine.
I learned a lot, and there is a lot to say about this presentation. So this is wonderful. And actually, as the last slide reflects, so when Alan talked about ICCCASU, so Alan himself is the best way to reflect ICCCASU because he's here from Canada. He's been living in Angola for more than 40 years and working there. And he has been also interested on some of the work and the lessons learned from China. So, which reflect ICCCASU because we talked about ICCCASU is International Conference or Council on Canada, China, Canadian, Chinese, and African urban development. So this is the best way to reflect. And we've seen that Alan showed they reflect about
the experience in China and what has been urbanization or urban development status in China, Africa, and even here in Canada. So one of the big trends, some of the great lessons, and something that struck me when he was talking about the experience in Angola. So I remember in Angola, like 20 or 30 years ago, most of the people were afraid to go to Angola because of the civil war
between Savimbi and Eduardo Santos. So the country was a little bit
like two bloc fighting each other. So, but he has been interested in working there. So this is something very good. And we learned from what Alan said, the trend where people are moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, and we've seen that the trend. So this is something that is happening in this two regions, Africa and China. And when he talked about urbanization in China, he mentioned that urbanization has been an engine of economic development, economic growth. Because as urbanization, China has been urbanizing, we've seen that people getting out of poverty, and urbanization has been engine also to poverty reduction. But in the same time, when he talked about Africa and particularly Angola, so we've seen that we have not got the same trend of poverty reduction from urbanization. It has been increasing pressure to the government, but we haven't seen the same level of development of economic growth as we've seen in China, where cities have been developed and the government have been providing facilities for the citizens. So this is something we can see as a difference between China and Africa urbanization. So on that, he also mentioned about a lot of challenge that African countries are facing, especially Angola, but also the boom, the housing boom that happened in Angola, which was supposed to be something that was going to improve the life of people. But, we see that there is problem of affordability. Not everyone in Angola was able to get the houses, even all the Chinese, as you say, that we can just make a difference. It's not just Chinese FDI going there, but it has been a lot of that Angola has been contracting to have this housing. But by the end of the day, if people are not able to afford it, then there's a question of sustainability of this move. And we know that because this has been, kind of debt from Angola to from different institutions. So the citizen of Angola will be paying this for a longer period, but we would be very happy to see if the livelihood of the poverty has been reduced in this region, but we've seen a very different picture on that. And Alan has raised a lot of challenge, but I am going to leave the floor to you so that we can discuss about that. But before that, I'm also going to call on John Zacharias online. He will be also giving some comment and some feedback on the presentation of Alan, and then we'll move from there. Okay.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to see how I can fit into this appropriately. Well, first of all, thank you, Alan, for bringing together the challenges of urban development in Africa and China. And, it strikes me that we don't have much of that, not in the literature, not in public discussion. It's not going on. So this is really innovative for me, and I think it's a great beginning. It seems certain that China's presence in African urban development is going to grow. What model it takes is maybe less certain, but we need to have the discussion about how this connection between China and Africa can happen well, and whether the models are transferable. And these are huge discussions that for the most part aren't happening. So I'm really happy to see it, started out today, that's for sure. Now, but I have a question with regard to your presentation. It's a rhetorical question, really. Whether, as in the case of China, a large part of the economy is built up on real estate and housing in particular. We know that this produces a middle class, and it produces very rapid growth. I mean, Canadian citizens experienced this coming out of the Second World War. You invest in housing, you get rapid economic growth. So it's a winning model from that point of view. Whether that's good to build your economy on housing development and personal asset acquisition is a question, especially going forward here in our time with very serious sustainability challenges ahead of us. So other development models exist, and well, for example, moving resources massively into education and health. It's a viable economic development model. So, but and is far from what the China model is. I'm just saying it's out there. Another one is to see the government's role in building infrastructure and allowing quite a freewheeling economy to sort of use that infrastructure for self-development. And that's different as well. So these are just three examples here. You can put it into personal asset acquisition in the form of housing. You can invest in people. You can invest in infrastructure. I think it's worthwhile just seeing this the China model in that context. I think the pathways are still open for Africa. Well, all of Africa. Africa is so diverse, and it's hard to really generalize at all about Africa. But we do know that critical decisions have not yet been made that sort of, lock you into a particular urban future. So that is really interesting. It's more of a comment than anything else to say that this kind of opens, for me at any rate, a lively discussion on what those pathways are in Africa and what cities will be like, actually. They don't need to be like the cities that we have or that China has or what are they though? They might be, but these things really need to be thought about. Okay, I'm going to stop. It's my freewheeling commentary here. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Maybe we'll get the second comment from Jean-Marie, and then Anne will respond later. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Very good. So thank you so much, Alan. Thank you so much for your great presentation to us.
Sorry.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Actually, you gave us a very big pictures about what really has been done the last few years in terms of Chinese success of planning urbanizations and economic growth, especially the poverty alleviation. That really is really a case studies we have learned, and also you have a pictures which give us Africa in general, but Angola particular. I think some of the points you raise are really tangible. We learn a lot, but I'm going maybe to catch a few points, maybe some people who don't have any background about these two sides of relationship. The China-Africa relationship actually is really that for many years in the 50s, when struggling for independence, and then with the Africa. So they've been tried to help Africa, for getting independence until really in the 80s, when the economy of China started to take off. So the economic collaboration being a really reality. So maybe we have to know why China is investing in Africa in infrastructure. This is the really question people, they don't understand. So the biggest move of China of investment in Africa infrastructure has really started in the early 2000, 2010, when the economy was booming, when the country started getting a lot of financial reserves, US dollar especially. So where they have to relocate this finance, it's for a bilateral investment. So Africa has been the recipient of this type of investment, especially on bilateral level. We have a FOCAC, they create a mechanism they call FOCAC, which is a Forum of China-Africa Collaboration, where this way of investment, through loans, through helping it being done. So that's where China has been moving into, helping Africa building infrastructure, roads, airports. You have like housing issues, water utilities. You have a lot of hydropower for electricity. So this is rural realities. Now, our questions now is really how this mode of investment is doing, the way the contract in financing is really an issue. Maybe this part of probably, I don't know if you touch it in here, because when Chinese give a loan and financing, they contract a Chinese company to construct this in a system they call the turnkey project, all right? So no any other company can be involved in this type of finance. Means the money is actually repatriating back to China again. That's where many critics are, because local contractors or international contractors cannot participate in this type of finance. I mean, service and financing. So and second thing is like today, a lot of infrastructures are built. They build, you know, after a few years now, they're getting problem of maintenance. Who is going to maintain this infrastructure for long term? Africa has no ability. There is, because there is a question of knowledge transfer, technical knowledge, so that Africa can be long term, maybe doing themselves. This is a question now. Yeah. And another thing is infrastructure being built very fast. Question of sustainability, because climate change have shown that certain infrastructure being built very certainly distracting, you know, in city and the coast and a lot of places, because materials used and especially this really has brought again another question. Like today they are discussing the African corruption. The African corruption, I was reading a report on African corruption. Actually, the last 10, 15 years, the African corruption will grow because of, I mean, infrastructure, land management, and plus, I'm not talking about only Chinese, but the too many other foreigners like also in that field. Means infrastructure is not really sustaining, because you know a lot of corruption inside. That's what materials you use are not really sustaining. So another things is like the gentrifications, everything concentrated in the cities. So issue of decentralization of building second cities. I don't know, in Angola, you talk about the new city they are building. I'm not familiar with Angola, but I'm talking about some other countries I've seen. Now, most of infrastructure, they are pushing more on decentralizations, because they are in especially in a capital city. That's where they are, and that's where a lot of problems are. Today, with they're pushing on nature-based solution for environment. That is really, really a big challenge for Africa today. So now, my maybe last point I would like to mention is like there's so many other key players in the Africa infrastructure investment. So we know that I was reading World Bank, one thing that, of course, Exim Bank, China is #1. That's where what the money is flowing. I saw a lot of China Development Bank, but Japan is there, Germany is there, Netherlands, but in South Africa Development Bank as well. So now, do you think that this Chinese infrastructure investment mechanism, do you think is going to change, or is going to stay the same, because it's an exchange of a lot of resources? Should be oil, should be diamond, should be whatever, that the industry is highly need back home, that the Chinese doing. Do you think this model is going to change very soon, or you think that maybe some adjustment based on various, you know, critics on innovation and doing this? Yeah, that's my comment here.
All right.
Thank you. So, so Alan, can you answer the question? So, and then we'll see if we can jump again with the audience and people online. Yeah.
Switch my microphone. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll maybe discuss some of the points that John raised start with. Yeah, indeed, there are other alternative models that, and the model of investment in education on human capital, health, is very much the model that the World Bank and the African Development Bank are promoting. On the other hand, we have a situation specifically in Angola and of a post-conflict country where there was a real need for investment in infrastructure, and that money didn't. I mean, the World Bank had talked about post-conflict reconstruction, but the money never came. So the only choice that Angola had was to turn to China, basically. So, but in terms of the lessons from China, I think the one about land value capture, or land an approach to the opportunities of land reform in a post-socialist country are really interesting, and not just for urban, but for rural development as well. Because without secure tenure, there's a real reluctance for private sector to invest in cities, but also to invest in agricultural development when land tenure is not secure. So I think the land reform model that can learn from the Chinese experience, at least in countries where as I mentioned, the post-socialist countries that have left the power of land management in the hands of the state, in many cases, the state without really any capacity of managing that land. There are real opportunities there. And the model of decentralization, I think these are key lessons from China that could produce very different results in Africa from the kind of model of high-end, housing and kind of wasteful real estate booms and these kinds of things. So I think the lessons around land are really important for Africa. But the model that my own organization is a proponent of and have been very much engaged with over the years is a model of slum area upgrading of, and I mentioned, I think I included a couple slides about participatory planning and participatory development. That's a very different model from the Chinese model. Is not very, from my understanding, it's not very participatory. Some of our, we have partnerships with a number of Chinese institutions, civil society and academic institutions, who are feeling the space for dialogue and participation seems to be closing in China in recent years as well, which is a real concern. So for sure, other models. The model that we in Angola we feel has great potential is learning from Brazil under particularly the urban reforms under President Lula and in the early 2000s, and the slum upgrading, they call favela bairro, or the transformation of slum communities into self-managed secure communities with basic infrastructure and land tenure. These are the kinds of models that I think have great potential in Angola, and in other countries in Africa. I know even the municipal government in Johannesburg in South Africa are developing relations with communities in Brazil, and hopefully that will accelerate after the upcoming elections in Brazil, where we hope that we'll see a return for that more populist regime of Lula. No, we'll see. We'll see what happens there. Now, Jean-Marie, yeah, is absolutely right in terms of the dangers of the mechanisms of contracting of these Chinese credit lines. The fact that Angola has lost a major opportunity in all of that development in housing, even at the high end of the housing market, if they had employed Angolan labor, trained Angolan contractors, and developed local building industries to produce the materials instead of importing all of this from, and it wasn't just China. It was because that model was used by the Israelis and the Brazilian companies as well. But China was the largest beneficiary of that model of now. Mechanisms and change, absolutely. I think these are, for us in Angola, finally the Angolan government has come to terms with learning from the experience and gathering evidence about the impact of the development model. And we've been very much engaged with this process of reflection. And it's going to be difficult for the Angolan government to come to terms with some of the new strategies that we and UN Habitat are very much engaged in. The World Bank is also engaged in, for the first time in Angola, in looking at the urban issues and potentially mobilizing some financing for other models of urban development. But I do think that the opportunity of this Chinese financing could be used for slum upgrading, low-cost housing. For a lot of good work was done on urban infrastructure and rebuilding the infrastructure at the end of the war. But also a lot of money was wasted on prestige white elephant, I think, or white elephant projects. I mean, they aren't seen as white elephants by the middle-class civil servants who benefited from that. But from the point of view of the poor, the peace dividend that should have benefited everyone in the nation went to a specific class of people in Angola, and there's a lot of discontent today, and a sense that urban reform, land reform, and development policy reform is needed. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Alan. So on that, I'll say, because you say probably it could have been better to have this financing being directed to build houses that could be affordable for the low-income people, instead of just, as you say, public servant, or maybe people who, because a lot of all these houses have been, purchased by those who initially have, purchasing power in terms of, maybe they're government officials or maybe they're businessmen. But one might say that maybe the cost of labor was high because, of course, they got Chinese who came and built. But generally speaking, in Africa, they say, okay, when they bring Chinese to build, it's a lot cheaper than when they
French or
yes, exactly.
American,
yes, American.
Exactly.
Exactly. So if they have they had to rely simply on Angolan. So maybe it might take a little bit longer for them to get the skills, to build on that. So, financial system can change from one year to another. So, okay, so if we were gonna wait for 10 years so that Angolan can get the capacity to build so that it can be cheaper, maybe China would not be the same, the financial condition would not be the same. So it's a lot of, game to be played by the government or the officials who want to get access to tap into this opportunity that was presented. Because if they were to wait today, maybe see now interest rate around the world is increasing because you can't predict on what can do. So, and an official can say, okay, let's tap to this opportunity. Maybe after 5 years, Angola would not be a priority for the Chinese or maybe for the Brazilian. It's going to be another country. So that's also can be some of the question. This is just some of the discussion it's been raised when I discussed with some other counterpart maybe from the Angolan. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, as you said, probably the government could have thought of building houses, or maybe the Chinese, because the money was coming from Chinese, they could have thought of building houses that could be affordable to Angolan. Say, because most of the apartment, maybe it's a standard of Chinese or maybe standard of Europeans, which is good, maybe because we want to increase the level. But general Angolan people, maybe African, they would say they would have maybe 2 rooms, the houses with 2 rooms, or maybe general bathroom. That could be cheaper if you put it in a community. I mean, maybe sanitary is not the best, but because if they want to target the low-income people, then they had to build things that can be affordable. Because if you put bathroom, kitchen the same, the cost is increasing, and then people who are the target for that policy may not be able to afford that. So I don't know what's your say on that. Before we pass it, I just want to go roll on that because we're already discussing on that. Yeah.
Okay. I think I need to.
Yeah. No, the interesting question, but from I'm an architect, urbanist, and it's a little bit difficult for me to suggest that not to invest in housing, but I really think that was a bad investment. I think the Chinese investment would have been far better put into infrastructure such as water, sanitation, even in the creation of the investment in instead into building industries or training or something like that, because the time saved in bringing expatriate labor and materials, I think I think that was a bad decision in any case, from my point of view. I don't really think that housing in national development requires foreign direct investment. I think it's interesting. I was invited to a meeting in Ethiopia by the African Development Bank a few years ago, and arrived in Addis Ababa, and I found projects that looked just like Kilamba on the outskirts of Addis Ababa. And I said, oh, the Chinese are investing here. But that housing was all built by local contractors, local building materials. And what was financed by the Chinese was that, you saw that photograph of the rapid rail link. That was the technology that that China financed. And I think those decisions in Ethiopia, another post-socialist country, by the way, were far more appropriate and sustainable. than the decisions that Angola took in taking a large piece of that financing for housing that is basically still being paid off today. And as I mentioned, you know, they financed a segment of the population that could have afforded to pay for housing, commercial housing, you know. So, you know, the Angolan population are going to be paying off that subsidized housing for the well-to-do for the next number of years, you know. So yeah, I think that the investment could have been directed in a more appropriate way, a more productive way.
Okay, thank you, Alan.
So any questions from
the public
or maybe from
audience online? So, Naveed, right? Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a very good and educational, at least for me. And I'm so sorry about my basic question, or maybe elementary question.
Can you introduce yourself if you don't?
I'm Naveed, and I'm PhD student here at uOttawa. My supervisor is Professor Chow. And yeah, and I have a PhD in urban planning also. So yeah, my question is that, as you mentioned about the land leasing model in China, which at first in the past, it was like the central government had a fixed fee for any land use trading and land leasing. But after the years, they noticed that municipality governments gaining so much value from that, and they changed it to percentage, and it's not the fixed value anymore. And as me and Professor Chow and Lichin has an article about neoliberalization and land use, and one of our cases was China, we noticed that still the land leasing is a main revenue for municipalities, but only for big cities and cities those have access to sea trade route or with harbor and etc. And small cities with the small market doesn't gain that revenue based on the land leasing. So my question is that adopting that land commodification from China and put it on the Angola, I don't know about the Angola, but I don't think the major cities in Angola has a big market like Shanghai or Guangzhou and Beijing. So is it the commodification, land commodification model in Angola, even if we decentralize the land management from the state to the municipality governments or states in Angola, the surplus value or capital return, is it really enough to be accelerated or to accelerate the engine of urban growth in Angola, even in a small market like Angola cities? You know, my question is, I don't think that that surplus value or the partnership would help very how can I say it? So I think that that surplus value or capital return, even if in a municipality states, will not help the urban growth or urban development, even in major cities. And I think it will be cover some costs, because a revenue which is not consistent and stable cannot be considered to the investing that capital into some high cost projects like affordable housing, and think that we can gain some profit from that. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Naveed. So is there any other question before?
I mean, that's that. Could I discuss that first, because that's a big question.
Okay.
And I really look forward to reading your paper, because I have a lot to learn about how China has used or misused land, land value capture. And I mean, but it's not just China that uses land-based financing for municipal development. I mean, Ottawa does. I mean, almost every city in North America or Europe bases their revenue on local taxation, or that is based on other forms of land revenue, not necessarily on leasing or there are many different ways of it could be on rezoning or development rights that could be bought and sold. There are many different ways of I think for us in Angola and a number of other African countries as well. I know Mozambique is starting to really look at the opportunities for municipalities in local taxation and things like this. There are different forms of land use land value capture. So I'm just, I mean, and Angolan cities Luanda has 9 million people. I mean, these are some substantial cities. We have a number of cities with 1 or 2 million population, and Luanda is a mega city. It's one of Africa's. It's probably Africa's 4th or 5th largest city. So, so some of those lessons from big cities in China may be useful. So yeah, and I really look forward to reading your paper, your article.
Okay,
Sorry.
perfect. Thank you. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. Any number? Any
coefficient?
Yeah, coefficient. Yeah. So I'm quite like, oh, it's interesting. So through this Gini coefficient, we can say, okay, which city suffers more in inequality. So may I ask like where we can how we collect those data and how we produce this Gini coefficient.
Yeah,
You can find data on Gini coefficient from a lot of them a lot of this data is from the World Bank, and the World Bank tracks. There are a number of websites that use World Bank data, and so that's something that you'll have to Google and look online. And I'm sure Professor Chow and others can help you with getting access to the sources of data on Gini coefficient. It's something that's tracked. I think the World Bank is the principal institution that tracks this.
So it's more like an economic.
I can pass the one paper.
Oh, okay.
It's a rather complicated calculation that they make, to
Yeah.
They usually use this for performance analysis.
Yeah, because when I saw those whole charts, like instead of top 5, probably just trying with coefficient, I found that Hong Kong is also factor of 6.
Above 0.4 to consider start.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Really nice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question?
Maybe there's
Okay.
anybody online.
Is it online? Yeah.
Yes. Actually, I don't think it's a question.
No, we can barely.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. No.
No.
Just your voice.
So,
Speak.
yeah, can you hear? Can you hear?
No.
Very clear. Very clear.
Okay,
Very-
it's very clear
Tonto?
from John. Okay, yeah, this is much better. Yes.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I don't think it's questions. What I want to say is about some ideas. I just I have from Professor Cain's presentation, because it's a very big topic, and I'm interested in some points, and also have some extended thinking or questions or ideas about it. So I just want to show and for the discussion. Maybe it's also for the ICCCASU topics, and we can think about. And I think land finance plays an important role in China's urbanization process. And however, the real estate bubble is a big challenge for sustainability. So will land finance continue to play a role and continue to play sustainable role when urbanization level goes higher in the future? And during the COVID, the pandemic period, the economic the economic development has been slowed down, and a negative growth in the real estate market also presented. So the demand from the real estate market also caused extended impact for the demand for land finance model. So China's government has some reform or continuously reform on the land finance policies. So I think this could be some points that we can discuss for the model. How can the China's urbanization model play a role on African countries? And another part is, will a housing bubble negatively impact the sustainable natural population growth? So it's different. It's from urbanization, from the land finance policy, the real estate market, and to population growth. Because even though China has a huge population, and natural population growth is also still a matter of concern. Especially in recent years, China started to reform the policies to increase natural population growth. But the real estate bubble seems to be one of the negative factor, for the achievement of the population growth. So will the land finance policy for urbanization and the real estate market and the real estate pricing goes higher and higher, and the population growth will be a concern for the sustainability. So that's what I'm thinking is for the social aspects. And
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you have another question?
Okay, that's it. I just have some ideas for the, some comments. It's not questions.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very short. There are two aspects, two points. One is due to the difference of the economic development stage, China's existing policy or the past policy on land market, real estate development, and the infrastructure construction should be effective for African countries. This seems to be an inevitable stage, for urbanization, especially at an earlier stage. However, for China, the appropriate adjustment for land finance has always been the focus of macro control. Although the real estate market continues to rise, driven by various factors. So how to adjust the land policy and let the land policy to be appropriate for the specific country or region is very important, I think. So
okay. Oh,
yeah.
okay. So
That's it.
sir, I have to cut
Yeah.
that because we're almost 9. So just gonna make sure we finish before 9 so that we don't overcome. So we have another question. We'll take it quickly. I see the name here is Yan. If you can unmute and introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
Hello, would you like me to read it?
I'm sorry?
Would you like me to read the question?
Oh, no, you can ask your question however you want. So
okay, no,
I just want you to introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm Yan Li.
Okay.
I'm from the Graduate School of International Development and Global Studies.
Okay.
And
University of Ottawa?
Huh?
At the University of Ottawa?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And the question here is, first of all, I just read what I wrote on in the chat part. So it's first of all, thank Professor Cain for the presentation. And Professor, you have mentioned that housing projects developed in the process of urbanization basically benefit middle school or even just upper middle school. I just wonder if the trickle-down effect works at all in this situation in Angola, or does it help at all to the overall economic growth in Angola, while I fully acknowledge the severe polarization of wealth? And that's it for the question.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for the question. I think, is there any other question, the last one? If not, then I'll ask Alan to go ahead and answer to the question. But after that, there won't be any questions. So if you have any question now, just let us know. Any other question? Okay, good. So Alan, go ahead.
I'm sorry, the last question I didn't hear. If you could repeat the.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I mean, actually, if you heard it, please.
There's the trickle-down
Please repeat.
effect.
I can't hear it from.
Trickle-down effects, does it work in the situation in Angola? The trickle-down effect.
Okay, so she says, okay, let me go ahead. I didn't follow properly.
Yeah, it's in the
okay.
Yeah.
All right, okay.
Hi, Professor Ken, thank you. The present.
Okay. Okay. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Yan. And yes. Right.
Yeah. You can cut the mic on that.
Okay, good.
The first question, I would just like to make a comment on the real innovation, and I think what we can learn, or what from an African point of view can be learned from China, is the fact that China is constantly evaluating and gathering evidence, and policies are evolving in China. And I think that's the lesson that everyone can learn from, is that those problems that I presented in the graphics, we know are being addressed, are considered. And when, was it 3 years ago when we were together in Chengdu? This was a city that I've never been in a cleaner, quieter, greener city in my life. So these issues are being clearly addressed in even motorbikes were electric, everything was, and I assume based on some sort of renewable energy. So, I mean, these problems are being addressed. And the problems of overextending of the lack of saleable leases and land, is being addressed in terms of the new forms of more sustainable approaches. And I think it's largely because of the system of academies in China that there's a constantly a learning environment there on and policies develop, and there in too many countries policies are stagnant, and there's little learning from even when evidence is produced. So I think above decentralization, land value capture, and all of this, I think what can be learned from China is the reflection and the evolution of policy, and yeah. And I know that the state is concerned about. I mean, we can see that there's almost a regular reform of these development policies. So I think that's really quite interesting. And the last question related to, remind me again.
EAN?
Yeah. What? Oh yes, yes, of course.
Same
Yes,
question.
yeah.
It's the same question, actually.
I don't
Just wonder for overall, like you explained, it did
economics.
help overall.
I'm not an economist, but I haven't seen investing at the high end of the market. Normally, subsidies are captured by the politically influential classes of people, and very little trickles down. So I think that I don't have any faith in trickle down theory of development myself. So and it hasn't worked in Angola.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Can you give the floor to Alan?
Thank you. So this presentation was wonderful. I like it. I learned a lot. From the Angolan perspective, Chinese, and also the Canadian, perspective as well. So as I say, Alan is a true representation of ICCCASU because of all perspectives we can bring together. And I think, as we said from the beginning, and for those who know ICCCASU, so this is the platform where we put together practitioners, decision makers, scientific people from different backgrounds, architects, so that they can bring the experience and share the experience with different people. So it's a good platform, and we've been so very lucky to have Alan today giving a presentation, and especially that's the first presentation after receiving his honorary degree from the Gulf University. We appreciate so much your time, and we thank everyone here.
We have a drink after that.
Oh yeah, after. Okay, so have a drink after this session, celebrate and to congratulate Alan for this big achievement. And so for those who are following us online, so thank you again for your participation. And for those who are not very familiar with ICCCASU, are not engaged, so ICCCASU is a volunteer-based organization. So we invite you to join us. We've been now preparing for the 5th edition of ICCCASU to be held in Nairobi in Kenya, after the 4th edition that was held in Montreal online, was virtually, but was in Montreal here in Canada. Thank you again for your participation. We're looking forward to having you different and next ICCCASU talks on different various topics on Canadian, Chinese, and African sustainable urbanization. Thank you again, and bonsoir à tous et à la prochaine.
Okay, so if someone wants to do, so yeah, follow us. I will do that. Okay.